Hi, everybody. My name is Lori Cohen. I'm the Executive Director of the Beagle Alliance, and I just want to welcome everybody to the town hall. As usual, thank you guys for coming. This is actually our last town hall of the year. We don't do one in December because we know everybody's busy. So thank you all for being here. We have B. Nicholson, who is our webmaster IT graphics, who is also the co-host. So if by some chance there's a technical difficulty, then B will take over. So thank you all again. Welcome, Monica Engebretson, the head of public affairs in North America for Cruelty Free International, who I was very much looking forward to meeting at the World Congress, and we did meet, and Monica agreed to do one of our town halls. So as you can see, we've already got Monica sharing the screen, so I will leave it to you. Thank you so much for being here, Monica.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. I'll just do a quick background. So Cruelty Free International is headquartered in London, and it was founded back in like 1847. It was originally called the British Union for the Abolition of Vivisection. It was founded by a women's rights campaigner Frances Power Cobbe, who turned her attention to the use of animals in research and science. And in 2013, the organization changed its name to Cruelty Free International to reflect the international work that we do, because so much of animal experimentation and testing is international. Cosmetics companies are international, drug companies. If testing's required in one part of the world, those animal tests will take place regardless of whether one country has prohibited or stopped a certain test. So it's really an international effort. And I'm based in California and run our US campaigns. And I have also worked in Canada. I worked in Canada for many years to work on passing the cosmetics testing ban that just finally went through alongside the Body Shop Canada and other partners. And so this talk, we're talking about the placement of animals formerly used in research. And to kind of set the background, what we're talking about in the US in terms of numbers, you can see them on the screen. The US uses a lot of animals, and these are the 2001 statistics, which are the most current ones available from the USDA. Our government does count the numbers of animals used in research. That does not count the numbers of mice, rats, and birds, fish, or amphibians, so it doesn't count all animals. But we do get numbers on dogs, cats, and rabbits, which are the focus of this talk. And one thing at the bottom of the screen, it also they count pain categories. So they will note the number of animals used in a procedure that doesn't cause pain, ones that cause pain, but pain relief is provided. And then they have the category E experiments where no pain relief is provided. And we have numbers on that. And there's the numbers of the dogs and rabbits that are involved in those sorts of. And in 2015, we also conducted, our organization, a worldwide estimate of numbers that did provide estimates on the numbers, including the numbers of rats and mice, to give you an idea of where things stand internationally. You can see that the US is one of the top users of animals in the world, and Canada is actually right up there too, but quite a bit under the use of animals that the US uses. So that's just sort of just to start off the numbers. But thankfully, now one thing that the USDA, we do have an Animal Welfare Act that covers some aspects of the use of animals in research. And I know this is something, that we have that Canada doesn't have. So it's a good thing that at least there is some number tracking, but it does not dictate what happens to animals after research. There's no laws, federal laws that say what will happen to an animal after research is completed. And so what had happened over the past 8 years or so, individual states started passing laws requiring at different levels the adoptions of animals after their use in laboratory. They're all a little bit different, but what they have in common is that they all address dogs and cats. They're limited to dogs and cats, and some of them cover just taxpayer-funded or institutes of higher education, and sometimes they cover all laboratories in states. They're a little bit different there, but they are similar in that they allow the facilities to develop their own adoption policies and to determine whether an animal is adoptable or not. They usually have something that says that the facility is not liable should they allow an animal to be released and something happens, person gets bit once they've, or something happens, they are released from the liability with the exception of some gross negligence. And they all allow facilities to work with shelters and rescue organizations to place animals. They can place them themselves or work with rescues. Those are some of the commonalities. So here on this map here, you can see the US states. In pink are states that have already adopted some post-research adoption laws. The turquoise states are ones where legislation was introduced this year. And the orange states, New Jersey and Massachusetts, are states that have existing laws, and they actually came back with new legislation to strengthen those laws. And then in the middle, these are states with no laws. And so what our organization has been working on is the Companion Animal Release from Experiments Act. And this bill will be a federal bill, so it would cover all states and would require that all research facilities that receive funding from the National Institutes of Health to implement policies for the research and adoption of dogs, cats, and rabbits. So it would go further that it would include rabbits and dogs and cats. And the reason we focused on the NIH, the National Institutes of Health is the world's largest funder of animal experiments. And this is also, NIH funding comes from taxpayers. So this is kind of the hook that we have in that taxpayers should have a right to say, what we paid for these animals, we should have a right to say what happens to them. There's resistance in telling private industry what to do, but it still would amount to a lot of animals, should this pass, to require that at least those facilities have plans in place for animals that are no longer wanted. Sometimes these animals are animals that have survived an experiment. Maybe it wasn't particularly invasive. And then lots of times animals are overbred. They are surplus animals. And so sometimes these animals have had no experimentation done on them. They're just surplus to the needs of the laboratory. And it's often more convenient just to kill the animals than to deal with trying to adopt them out. So it would include all of them. What it would also do is say that the facilities have to make their adoption policies publicly available on their website. This is a bit of accountability. Something that we've seen as a flaw in some of the other states is that some states have requirements. And when I did a FOIA request, for example, in California, asking universities for their adoption policies, some of them didn't even have them. So if you don't have an adoption policy in place, how are you complying with the law? So that this would be an accountability piece. And then further, it would require them to maintain records on the numbers of dogs, cats, and rabbits that were used and the number of those that were released for adoption. This is also, once again, an accountability piece. If you're tracking and keeping track of animals that are adopted, you're more likely to comply with the law if there is something that can be looked at to see whether the law is having the intended impact. I'm going to pause there for a second before going to the next slide in case there's some questions about everything that I've just sort of dumped out there to get the conversation started.
Yeah, thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions while Monica's pausing? I think I have a couple, but I just want to see if you guys have anything pop into your head. I'm just curious, Monica, because, well, I just want to comment that I like that the adoption piece has to be on their site and it's an accountability piece. But if you wouldn't mind, this is so much more advanced than in Canada. We don't have any laws stating that any of the animals have to be released. We are moving towards that with our regulatory body. And that's, of course, what we're hoping for in the near future, that's a strong suggestion. And of course, we're, always asking for legislation. But what are the reasons, do you find, when the facilities are able to decide for themselves why an animal should not be adopted? My first instinct towards that is that, okay, then they could come up with a million reasons why the animal doesn't have to, or is not eligible for adoption, and then therefore they could go on quietly euthanizing the animal. So is there any sort of criteria that they have to follow so that it's not just up to their discretion?
Yeah, so some states have tried to look at that, but it gets very difficult in dictating how you've decided whether an animal. Some have decided to say, and I don't know that any of these laws have passed, that they need to document the reason why. So then you would be able to, do a FOIA request, say, for some reason, why is this facility not finding any animals are acceptable for adoption? What are the reasons they were not eligible for adoption? Why, was that the case? And I think sometimes it's just a matter of the culture changes within a facility. Once they get comfortable with doing it, they've had a good experience, then it's more likely to happen, and they're more likely to expand it to more animals. I think that's part of it, but it's also just when you're passing laws, unfortunately, you often don't get everything that you want, and they start getting real touchy when you're telling them exactly what to do. And in some cases, like in California and other states, the laboratories would say that they already were adopting animals, but they objected to being told what to do. But when they're taking taxpayer money, that is part of the deal. When you take, that's often the key is whether it's publicly funded. If you're taking taxpayer money, then that is one of our tools, that you also are responsible for letting taxpayers dictate a little bit of what happens in your facility.
Right.
So that is a concern there.
Okay. And then what about the private facilities? Is that, because in Canada, of course, private facilities don't have to follow any regulation. They don't have to report, period. They're not required by law. And if they're not being funded by the government, then there's no incentive to follow the voluntary regulations here. Some do anyway, so that they're showing that they're following that, but nonetheless, they don't necessarily have to. So what's that like in the States?
So some states do apply to all testing facilities, but in those states, there may not be that many testing facilities. So it's easy to make a law apply to something that doesn't take place in your state.
Of course.
And that's probably the case. Or there's few of them, or they're not using that many animals to begin with. So yeah, you have to start where you can. And obviously for our organization, the bigger picture is that we don't want animals in labs either. So we're working on that end to promote the alternatives and, those sorts of things. So we want a day when animals aren't there to begin with. But in the meantime, we do want to push this issue that their individual lives are valuable and they should have a chance when they're no longer needed in the laboratory. But yeah, that's the problem with legislation, that it's hard and you don't usually get what you want, but it's worth doing anyway. It's all about moving the bar forward. So yeah, you're absolutely right.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what we find here too, is that it's twofold. We want, obviously, the goal is to focus on advocating for non-animal use, but in the meantime, there's animals within the laboratories that could be cared for better and could also leave. And so you're always working on both of those pieces. So anyway, anybody else with any questions? Otherwise, I'll let you go on to your next slide, Monica, if you'd like to continue.
The next slide is more of a fun slide. So I actually didn't mention that the bunny that you see in this picture here, this is my rabbit Moira. And you can see at this point, she still had the laboratory metal tag in her ear there. She was rescued from a laboratory in California, and she's hopping around my office right now. She has free range of the office, so she's hopping around. So interestingly, I have the next slide, if it'll play. It's a video of Moira in the first week of her coming here. She was terrified of people, and yet she developed this and didn't get along with other lab rabbits. They were aggressive to each other. So I had another rabbit out in my living room, and yet she developed this friendship with a cat. And I think that's probably, maybe we've talked about this, Lori, there's some commonalities of how animals come to trust humans and how they come out of their shells and the different ways in which they do that. That there is some commonalities. And here's a video of sort of the process that my rabbit took. It was through her association with my cat that helped facilitate her taming and coming to be a house rabbit versus a laboratory rabbit. So let me see if it'll play. Here's them playing together. So you can see Moira had already, there's not really any sound on the video. She'd already within the first week had started using her little litter box considering she probably was raised in a cage suspended above a wire cage suspended above her own waist with nothing to do. She instantly was exploring her environment there. At the time, I had a cage set up, X pen.
Yeah.
And then she was very terrified of me, but she loved my cat. And you can see them starting to, and she had probably never seen a cat before, but you can see that she was very curious about her. And here they are playing together. And this, otherwise, she would just hide from me. And so if I came in here and sat and the cat came in, then she'd come out and play. And it was really helpful for that next step of getting her used to being around people, and that they're clearly playing together and enjoying each other's company there.
That's
So
amazing.
that's
That's just
Moira and Cotton.
that's awesome.
So
Well, and they really do,
that's,
they associate, I mean, and we see this with the beagles as well, and we see this, and primarily, unfortunately, we see this with men when the beagles go into foster homes. It can take anywhere from weeks to years for them to be comfortable with the men or the males in the home, and we can only assume it's because there's more males that are in the laboratory setting, but it's quite a process for the fosters, because people take it personally, they get upset, and really it's just a process. And of course, that's why in many instances, depending on the trauma, we do ask that there's another animal in the home, because that's where they feel safe and where they sort of start learning the cues and unwinding a little bit, just like Moira did, obviously. Yeah.
yeah. It's interesting you mentioned the men issue, because when Moira first came, she got used to me. But anytime my husband would come in, she would run and hide and then do a thump, the warning thump of danger
Really?
that rabbits do, if you're familiar, and thump the ground. She doesn't do it anymore, but there was definitely a difference in her reaction to giving a warning signal when a man entered the room.
Yeah, it's a pretty common thing for us, depending. They're all individuals, so they're different, but
Yeah.
it's a common thread in the triggers for some of these guys, as we've seen over the years, for sure. Yeah. So Cruelty Free International, and please, if anybody wants to interrupt me, by all means, we're here to ask Monica questions. I don't want to take up all the time, but so can I ask what your plans going forward are in North America? And given that we're newer in Canada and we're almost at ground zero a little bit in Canada, because most people don't even know that animal testing takes place. And the cosmetic bill passing was a big deal. It sort of made that more known than what it was a year ago. But what are your plans going forward in North America, if you can speak of them?
Sure. With just regards to this issue, we have other issues that we're working on and reforming some other things with the NIH, and Canada did beat us in terms of passing a national law about cosmetics testing. The US still hasn't done that. We've done individual states. But with regard to this issue, we will keep pushing the CARE Act, but there's lots of ways to win. We don't have to necessarily push the legislation, pass the legislation as it is. What we've been successful is tucking bits of legislation into appropriations bills, and these are bills that must pass. So sometimes it's just a question pressuring. We can ask the NIH could pass a policy that says before I get a grant, they want them to include what will happen to the animal. So there's ways that we can step this forward. NIH could adopt a policy that recommends that grant seekers have plans in place for the adoption of animals, or they could even require it. There's different ways that this issue can be pushed forward. Improving the individual state laws, although that takes a lot of individual work and time, but that's something that you could probably do also in Canada. I know while they don't have laws govern it, there is this sort of that voluntary body where it's limited, of course, because there's no enforcement, but what that body recommends and pushes does impact practice. So if they start asking in Canada about retirement of animals and pushing that and recommending it, you will see more voluntary compliance. And there are people who work within the lab who do want this to happen. And sometimes those adoption policies are driven by people who work in the laboratory for whatever reasons that they are there. They often do develop attachments to the animals and would like to see a different outcome for those animals. And the more it becomes normalized and they have a good experience in working with rescues, and some rescues, of course, can't say where they've gotten the animals because the facility doesn't want to know, doesn't want to be outed. As I think that's one of the conflicts with some of the facilities is they don't like to remind people that animals are used in research. So when animals are released from the lab, it reminds everybody that this is still happening. So it's sort of a double-edged sword, I think, for the laboratories. As much as maybe they want it to happen, they don't want to remind people that they're experimenting on animals.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and we find that in Canada, and most definitely the Canadian Council on Animal Care, the CCAC, is absolutely moving towards the suggestion and the recommendation that animals are rehomed, eligible animals are rehomed, which is wonderful and very much hope for the future. And we're hoping to work with them on that. But that is the point that always comes up, is that number one, it does remind, I think in Canada, it reminds people who already know, but it also makes it known, because it really isn't commonly known in Canada. For whatever reason, Canadians believe that those kinds of things happen elsewhere. And so, as I say, we're kind of starting from that place. But also that I think there's a safety factor there. I think that the laboratories, there's sort of an unspoken sort of fear that there'll be hate issues and people blaming and people coming into labs and causing problems. I'm imagining you still find that in the United States, where there's threats and people within the labs still feel frightened to speak out, even to the people within the labs and the people they work with.
Yeah, I think it's probably very individual, although I think there's been so many successful adoptions that it's the more success they have, the more likely that they are to do it. But that within the laboratory, there is probably it probably is very case by case, and it probably has a lot to do with the mood and the element within the particular lab and who's in charge, whether they are supportive of those or are against it. Because as we know, the hierarchy in labs can be very can determine a lot of what goes on based on who's there and whether there's a culture of accepting it, whether they will find the means to do the right thing.
So can I ask you a little bit about APHIS and the database? Because for us in Canada, there's private labs that we know of, and certainly you can go and research and find labs and in some cases find out if they're testing on animals. But there could be many private labs that are out there in our rural communities that we don't know about and don't have to report. But in the US, there's more of a database. APHIS has a database of laboratories, including private laboratories, that people, the general public, can look up to see what animals are being used, where they're being used. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because that's a pretty big, that's an important knowledge base right there to have.
Yeah, it helps to know the numbers. And what we don't track, which they do in other countries, is exactly what purpose the animals are used for. So you won't necessarily have the data. Sometimes you can kind of put it together based on studies that are being published, or if you look at the name of the facility, for example, you'll be able to figure out, oh, that's a place that creates antibodies using animals based on the name. But and I think, but even though that information exists, not very many people actually look into it. It's not something that the public is actively looking at all the time. But at least we do have some numbers because, and one thing, if you're working as we are as an organization to reduce the number of animals used in research or end it, you need to know how many animals you're talking about before you can know whether you're being successful. And the same thing at the government level. If they're talking about, sometimes they'll set goals saying part of their stated goal is to reduce the number of animals. And so when you ask the question, well, how do you know if you're reducing if you won't even count the rats, mice, and birds that you're using?
Right.
You can't do that. But I do realize we are in a little bit better position than Canada, that there is at least some data. But if other countries can count those animals, surely we can as well. But we just don't want to.
Okay, interesting. I know, working for a larger rescue, as Mary, our rescue director, and I did years past, that we use that database to approach laboratories. Like that was a way in which we could approach laboratories, which was quite a good resource that we don't have here. I mean, we know in Canada that the publicly funded universities and veterinary schools, that we can approach them. We don't necessarily know what animals are being used there, et cetera, or how many, and as you say, what's happening there. But again, there's no database that we can say, okay, these are the private labs in Canada that do test on animals. We could at least approach them and say, we'd like to help, whether or not, we would agree or disagree to disclose who they are. At least there's a database in which that you have as a frame of reference to approach and say, hey, we're here and we'd like to help you rehome the animals. So, but maybe, as you say, the general public doesn't really look at that.
No, they don't.
Yeah.
And they wouldn't know. It's not super easy to use. It's a bit confusing. And so it's there, but it's not super user friendly.
Okay. And so curious, is there a move? What's your, and forgive me if you've said this already, but with regards to the animals that they've decided are not, you're not counting. So the mice, the rats, the birds, what is Cruelty Free International? What do you guys say about that? Are you working towards having that change or that kind of data incorporated? What's your stance on that?
Yeah, well, we do publish like the world estimates, and in there we note that the US has to be an estimate because they don't track that data, unlike Europe where we have actual numbers. So it's pointed a lot. Another bill that we're working on is the Hearts Act, which is part of that bill, reforms how the NIH gives out grants to prioritize grants to non-animal methods and to make sure that researchers are actually looking for the new alternatives. But in there's also new funding for funding new alternatives and also reporting on the numbers of animals used, which would incorporate that. So that's a larger bill, like I said, that's going after kind of reforming the entire system to prioritize alternatives. And in there includes the counting of the numbers of birds, rats, and mice. That would be part of that.
That's awesome. Okay. Sorry, does anyone else have any questions? I just want to leave it open because we're now, I'm always looking at a different time zone. So, we're good. We're only at 8:04, 6:04, all of the time zones that I stare at. Connie, go ahead. Hi. Thanks, Connie, for being here.
Oh, you're on mute.
Unmute.
Oh, there you are.
Hi, Maria. Thank you so much for doing this. I have one question. I'm right next to me is my rescue beagle who Lori brought to me from Winnipeg to Toronto Airport, and I picked him up. He has 2 tattoos. One tattoo is in his groin and one tattoo is on his ear. And I'm wondering whether one is the breeder and one is the lab.
It's possible. I don't know for sure, but that would be, possibly that is what or if he was potentially traded. I don't know at what point. Sometimes they will sell animals to another laboratory. You know.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, the other thing is what you said about men. I'm glad you said that because my husband's very upset because Astro is still scared to death of him, and he's become very attached to me.
Oh.
And it'll make him feel better. I'm recording this so that he'll be able to watch it and understand that it is not him.
No.
So I'm glad that you said that. So that's really all. Oh, the other thing I wondered if you would do DNA. We had another beagle we rescued just recently from the streets of Detroit, and did DNA on him. He's all beagle. But what if you do a DNA on these beagles? What does it show?
I don't know that anybody's done that.
I was afraid to because I didn't want to know where it came from. I didn't want to know. I don't know because they'll trace like they'll show close relatives and whatever, and I'm thinking I don't know that I want to know that.
Yeah. I'm not sure if the DNA would be if it's significantly different between beagles. They're all, bred within these facilities, and they're large facilities, so it wouldn't necessarily be a small gene pool. But I wonder, it would be an interesting, if there is a difference, if there'd be certain commonalities, that you would see between a laboratory bred beagles and beagles that are bred outside.
We might do it, and then I will get in touch. I'll make sure I get the results to Lori. Maybe that's something you would be interested in.
Yeah, that's a curious question, actually, Connie. Yeah, that's a curious. That's
because I want to do it, but I'm just a little frightened. I don't know if I want to see what it shows, but I think we might, and then I'll make sure you get the information. Okay.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
So
I'm not sure how in depth they are. I know I've done it. I've done a DNA on my beagle. He was not a laboratory beagle, but I'm not sure how in depth. I guess maybe the different companies are different, but I'm not sure how in depth they go, if they just go to, several generations before or whatever, I guess.
Yeah, they go to like great grandparent was what we got. And this beagle found on the streets of Detroit was beagle all the way, everything. There was nothing else there. So I'm assuming that's what the beagles that are raised in the facilities would be, but I'll do that. I don't want to take up any more time. I will do that, and then I will send it to you. Okay, I'll send the results, and then if Monica would like to see it, then she would be welcome.
Great.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Connie. That's another point too, is the tattoos, is that we found that this is something that has always come up with my US counterparts and rescue partner, is that in Canada, tattooing our dogs is normal as an identification. So that's something that's different from the States. I found when working in the States, is that we tattoo our dogs here. When they get spayed or neutered, we tattoo them for identification. So the tattoo is not a significant way for instance, if a dog ends up in a shelter in Canada and has a tattoo, I know in the States, if a dog ends up in a shelter in the States and has a tattoo, that is an indicator that the dog might be from a breeding facility or from a laboratory. Whereas in Canada, that's not the case. And we're not entirely sure if the research facilities, private or public, tattoo their dogs specifically for laboratory. It might be a different tattoo, but we're not 100% sure, because tattooing our dogs in Canada is the norm. So that's something.
Yeah, in the US, it's microchip. Everybody microchips.
Right.
So the tattooing is not common. It is some breeders of rabbits will tattoo their rabbits' ears, but if the rabbits that have come out of this one facility in California all have the metal tags in their ear, which we have removed when they get spayed. So looks like Mike has a question.
Just a comment regarding the tattooing. It's often used by Canadian Kennel Club breeders
Mm,
to
Mm.
identify their pups.
mm.
So, yeah. So it's definitely not indicative of a laboratory or breeding facility in the same way that it is in the United States. I know when COVID
Definitely
hit,
not.
definitely not, right? And I know when COVID hit and a lot of laboratories across the states were dumping animals because of shutdowns, et cetera, you know, a lot of our outreach was with shelters to say, look, if you, here's an example of what might be a laboratory animal, give us a call. You know, they might be, but here it's, as we say, it's not indicative. So that's something that I'm still curious about. If anybody has any comments about that in Canada, I'm still curious about that, because I don't really know if individual facilities in Canada tattoo them proprietarily or not. I'm just, we, as many people know, and we're very transparent about this, we have not rescued animals from laboratories in Canada. We've reached out to many and we've heard little or no response. And I think primarily it's because of the fact that it hasn't become the norm. And I know it's not necessarily the norm in the United States either. It's just a little bit more ahead, but it's not been the norm. And then of course, there's no federal law that states that they have to rehome the eligible animals. So of course that's something we're working on, but yeah, so we'll see. That's the plan. That's the hope. That's the mission, is to rescue animals, obviously in North America, but primarily we'd really like to open the doors in Canada and have it become the norm. And same thing, not to out the labs or cause them any harm, but just to say, let's work together to have the eligible animals go on to live more years outside of the cage than they live inside, of course, which we know can happen. We've seen it now. So it's doable. These guys are resilient and forgiving, and they really become amazing companions. So it's definitely doable. If anyone has any questions, please, and thank you for your comments and questions. Monica, do you have any, what's your passion in Cruelty Free International? I love to hear what people say of why you joined, like, you know, how did you become involved? What's the greatest thing that you feel you've experienced since being with Cruelty Free International?
Oh, wow, that's a big question. So I've been in animal advocacy for my whole professional life. I went to college at Humboldt State to study wildlife and environmental ethics, and I worked for many years in wildlife advocacy, and then switched over in about 10 years ago to working for Cruelty Free International. This is an area that is just exploding right now, so it's actually a very exciting time to work in the issue of animals and research, because the technology has now caught up in so many areas with our ethics, that the new technologies that are coming through that are leading the way to paving the path, there's still ways to go, of replacing animals in so many areas of research, and working in those areas where there are alternatives and the animals test still exists, getting rid of those. And there's just an exciting time to work on that. And having another thing that we've really experienced, which has been refreshing, is the bipartisan support on these issues. We have bipartisan support on the HEARTS Act that I mentioned earlier, and the CARE Act. It's co-sponsored by a Democrat and a Republican. And those of you that follow U.S. politics, there's not a lot that these two parties agree on. But we get a lot of agreement in this area because there is so much promise. Many of the, we have a lot high cost of drugs. 92% of drugs fail when they are tested in humans. So the animal models are failing us, and these new technologies, not only do they save animals, but they are proving to be more predictive for humans. So we have both sides of the argument, whereas maybe, so many years ago, we were starting to get there in cosmetics, but it's branching out into other bioscience, the alternatives and the new technology. So that's part of it. I can't think of like the most, that's overarching as an exciting thing. And then just being when you work in advocacy, you want to be feeling like you're saving an animal every single day, which you guys maybe are when you do the direct care, but it's up and down. But over time, you want to see you're looking for a long-term change, and you're going to have the ups and downs, and sort of judging each day by the seeds you plant, not necessarily the harvest you reap, because it took 10 years, for example, to pass just the cosmetics law in Canada. And we worked for 10 years to get that to happen. And it's about sticking with it. And, you know, and that is a knockoff effect, because those same alternatives that are being used in cosmetics and that were developed for cosmetics now have applications in other things. And so it all builds, you know, everything, every seed, it may seem like low-hanging fruit, for example, to do the cosmetics, but it leads to the next step. And if we want, I had another video. You can't hear it at the beginning. You can watch it later, of the legislator who is the lead sponsor of the CARE Act. We did an event on Capitol Hill, which was a big success. We had a bunch of beagles come up to the Capitol, up to the US Capitol, for an event, a beagle meet and greet. And these were beagles that had been rescued from Envigo, which was the massive breeding facility that was actually found in violation of the Animal Welfare Act. And to be in violation of the Animal Welfare Act, those are minimal requirements. You have to be really bad to create a situation where animals are actually confiscated. And so these were some beagles that came up to Capitol Hill to meet the staffers and encourage support for the CARE Act. And we put together a little compilation video, and I'll try to share my screen. And we know that the volume isn't really high. Mostly it's just cute pictures of legislators and legislative staff enjoying beagles. But if you do go back, you can hear some of the statements are really impressive from Representative Cardenas, who has carried this bill and spoke very passionately about this issue. And in fact, this whole bill happened because Representative Cardenas's staffer asked us if there was any bill that he really wanted to do something for rabbits, because the staffer would bring her rabbits to the office and let them run around the office. And we'd always go over to Rep Cardenas's and see the rabbits in the office. And we said, well, you could do this adoption bill and include rabbits in it. And it sort of went from there. So I'll play that now for you if I can get it to work. Let's see, I'll share screen.
This cruelty has to stop. Just look at how adorable they are. The comments on the camera. Everybody for taking a break from going, oh, you amazing, amazing being. And us as human beings, we can do a better job. I know we can, to make sure that they don't suffer. It's really important that everybody understands that what my bill is going to do, the CARE Act, is make sure that if you take federal tax dollars, NIH funding to do your testing, you are going to be required to track and report every single dog, every single cat, every single rabbit that you have been working with, to make sure that they're released into a loving family.
That's it.
That's awesome.
So that was fun.
Yeah. That's
so
amazing.
staff are still talking about the beagle meet and greet. So it definitely got a lot of attention.
Absolutely. Well, there's nothing. And you know what? I just want to comment, because as a rescue and advocacy organization, you're right. When you have a rescue, there's nothing in the world like it. You're there and you're seeing you're seeing it happen. You're seeing them being freed. You're handing them over to loving people. And it's an immediate, you're saving lives. But that's not every day. That's, that is not the everyday. And the advocacy is so important, but every day you have to remind yourself that the advocacy, that some of the things that you're working towards, you might not get to see in your lifetime, or you might not get to see for 5 years. But just as you said, and we say this too all the time, Monica, is that we just have to keep planting the seeds, telling the labs in Canada we're here, reminding them that, look, we just want to help and rehome. You're just constantly planting seeds for the long term, knowing that you're not, at the end of the day, you're likely not going to see something at the end of the day, but you just have to keep plugging along. And I think one of the most important things about the In-Vigo rescue, and we spoke about this at the Animal Law Conference in Toronto this year, is that the Republicans and Democrats came together. And I think that in Canada, if the Conservatives and Liberals could come together on one small thing with regard to rehoming, that it would make a huge difference. And that's really what we're working towards. And the other point is that I think it's important to realize that it's not just an animal welfare issue. The animal use model is not 100%, nor is it 50% working. So even if it's not about animal welfare, surely it's a societal issue where treatments are being lost and cures are not being found and drugs are not, are not as useful as they could be, et cetera, however you want to word it. It's not just an animal welfare issue. So I think that we can appeal to all people in some way in order to move towards the non-animal use model.
Yes, exactly. So
it's a work in progress. It's a work in progress. But thank you. I see I'm getting a little sign that says your internet is unstable. So hopefully I'm not freezing on you guys or not tuning out. I don't know. But does anyone have any further questions? And on that note, Monica, do you have anything you'd like to add? I just really appreciate you being here and sharing what you guys are doing. It's incredible work. And thank you so much for what you're doing in North America and in Canada and the Cosmetics Act. It's just, 10 years, that's quite a victory after all of that time. But I just want to leave it to anybody else if they have any other questions, or Monica, if you have anything else that you'd like to share.
No, just thank you so much for having me. And obviously we'll stay in touch if there's anything I can do to help you all up there, or, maybe at the next World Congress, if you're going there, we should have a session just on homing and stay in touch. And obviously if there's any rescues involved, then we can try to work together.
Absolutely. We love when people meet the beagles, so we'll call you. Well, thank you so much. And as usual, thank you guys for coming.